Hey guys, and welcome back to Altaz-Review, where we discuss and compare all kinds of big gaming opinions. Today, we're going to talk about Final Fantasy XVI and the divisive nature of its combat system. Some older fans think the new combat might be straying too far from what we call Final Fantasy, while others think it's a good fresh spin. Well, why don't we take a look at the varied combat systems of some of the older games and compare it to what Final Fantasy XVI has achieved. Final Fantasy has always been a traditional turn-based RPG, and focused heavily into the story and balanced magic and weapons for different encounters. At first, changing the formula simply meant adding more characters or adding new classes, but the basics remained the same, at least for the mainline games. The success for more action-oriented games began with spin-offs, and what better place to start than Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. Final Fantasy VII being one of the best-selling titles and having a character like Zack to expand on, Square Enix decided to try out a different style of gameplay. Crisis Core used a more action-heavy style of combat, but still used magic and skills as a strategic support. Ultimately, it was an action game where you slash and use blocking and dodging to fend off multiple enemies at once. The use of magic and unique skills added a strategic element, as the enemies were structured to have punishable weaknesses based on your magic and skills. Another focus is that Crisis Core has you using only one character throughout the whole story, and focusing on leveling this one character and equipping magic and skills that work for you as you progress through the story. It has a linear progression with some original characters that make up the cast for this story. Seemingly familiar to the current Final Fantasy, you defeat enemies as you move throughout a predetermined path and make your way to some mini-boss or a large group of enemies at the end of that dungeon. You have some cutscenes that flesh out each character's motives and personalities, and then you return to your home base after you're done. It's easy to see where Final Fantasy began its experiments for action gameplay while still holding close to its fan-favorite monsters, summons, and settings. Although Crisis Core strayed heavily from the usual Final Fantasy gameplay, it used an RPG system that encouraged strategic thinking to make magic stronger or to buff your skills to make them way stronger than they should be. Since it was technically a spin-off, nobody really compared it to the mainline games, and so it was still a well-respected game with a fresh twist. And then we have another experiment at action gameplay. Final Fantasy Dissidia is another spin-off series with a self-contained story, but unlike Crisis Core, it utilizes all the main characters from the main games. So even if it doesn't affect their stories, these beloved characters should be represented in a way that suits their turn-based counterparts. Dissidia was a 1v1 action game that later became 3-on-3 in a large environment where you use special attacks and ultimate attacks, vaguely similar to the Dragon Ball Z Tenkaichi games. This could easily be seen as either forgettable or as an insult to some well-established characters. But Dissidia put some real focus into the different movesets and gameplay. Every character had special attacks that represented the unique gameplay of each game, like Furion having mastery of all weapons from Final Fantasy II, or Cecil from Final Fantasy IV having a Dark Knight mode and a Paladin mode, and even Cloud using all of his limit break moves as his special attacks and ultimate attacks. Every character was made special by the unique elements of their own game, but the gameplay is what makes this game unique. Combat isn't just skill-based, but strategy-based. It gets a little complicated, but it boils down to this. There are two types of attacks, one dealing health damage and another type giving you bravery points. Your bravery points decide how much damage you do, but after you deal damage, these points will reset to 0 and slowly climb back to a default amount. So it's a strategic fight between wanting to build up bravery points for a huge attack or dealing smaller amounts of damage continuously. You also have some equipment and accessories that affect stats and bravery points and flesh out the system to make it feel more like a classic Final Fantasy game. So you're still working with stats and effects and playing this action game with an RPG mindset. It might not be one of the greatest Final Fantasy games ever, but it's one of the most creative hybrids between RPG and fighting games ever made, and the callbacks to older games also make for some great fan service. Now, getting further away from turn-based gameplay, Final Fantasy XV is the first mainline game to completely ditch turn-based gameplay and use a free open world with side content and non-linear progression, for the most part. Having multiple side quests and optional dungeons, Final Fantasy XV allows you to explore freely and choose your adventures. You can decide how many enemies you fight, and you have to use your skill with blocking and dodging to defeat any enemy. It's very possible to defeat high-level enemies with just your skill, but possible doesn't really mean easy. You still have a party and you can give them all kinds of armor and weapons, but you can't control them in battle. They'll be doing their own thing. This was a big step for the series, and this was where fans started to voice their complaints at having such an unconventional Final Fantasy. In the beginning, Final Fantasy XV really is a bit of a hack and slash, but after you get through the prologue stage, you see the Final Fantasy elements start to pour in. Weapon types have become the new weakness system. Heavy swords against larger foes, guns for flying enemies, spears for armored enemies, and more variations for different situations. Your main character, Noctis, can switch between 4 weapons at a time and make use of different enemies for different weaknesses, while your partners can still hold 2 weapons of their own that suit their unspoken class, like Ignis being able to use spears and knives, or Gladiolus being able to use heavy weapons and heavy shields. They all have a certain class type, and they still get to switch around between weapons and take advantage of enemy weaknesses. Magic is still a factor, but it's used as more of an overpowered tool. You can only hold 3 or 4 types of magic at the start of the game, and you have to experiment a little to make the stronger versions. So even if it's easy to get, your ability to use magic is a little held back since it's so powerful. Even party management gets more in-depth as you decide what special moves your team uses to either give you buffs or deal huge weapon damage against an enemy with a certain type of weakness. You can also get skills that let you control each character with their special movesets. Running into large groups of enemies feels similar to getting randomly jumped by enemies in older games, but you get some more freedom with the movement. Final Fantasy XV is a great action game, but its gameplay is held up more by strategically using weaknesses and party skills to take advantage of enemies, while you use items to give buffs and healing to you and your party members. The extra movement and action combat simply make fighting a little easier when you're up against more basic enemies. In any fight, you kind of switch between hacking away and then deciding all kinds of skills and combinations to use. But even then, the balance between action and RPG wasn't enough to compare Final Fantasy XV to its more creative predecessors. The action elements and the RPG elements didn't really blend together very well, and it felt like it wasn't such a great action game, but it also wasn't such a great RPG game, and that's really what makes Final Fantasy XV so divisive. Final Fantasy VII was already a near-perfect game in its time, and still remains a favorite for many gamers today. Now, the recent remake has repeated history and created a new era of fans who will call Final Fantasy VII Remake a masterpiece without compare. But FF7 Remake is praised for its own merits more than for its namesake. The same way each of the other games on this list tried to add action gameplay to the strategic RPG gameplay, Final Fantasy VII Remake finally did it perfectly. Using one of the greatest games of the series to try out an experimental combat style would either be the perfect combo or the dumbest end of a legacy. Luckily, it was the former. Using the same party system and RPG elements as the original, the remake took inspiration from recent games with an aggression-based stagger meter, kind of like what we've seen in Sekiro and Star Wars. It made stagger an important but situational mechanic. Some enemies were easier to defeat without relying on the stagger meter. Every character had a different amount of stagger damage, and some skills did more stagger damage while others were better at dealing health damage. The biggest innovation, however, was that it recreated the active timed battle system from the original. In the original, each character and enemy has a timer that decides when the character can make an action. They can keep waiting after the meter is full, but they can't do anything while that meter is filling up. So with this method, you could actually attack multiple times in a row if your meter is fast enough. In the remake, the active time battle, ATB for short, affects different actions like items, skill, and magic usage. But now you need to attack to fill up your ATB bar. So now there's a correlation between the action-packed combat and the strategic use of actions. If you want to use healing items or use magic as someone's weakness, you're gonna have to fill up that ATB bar before you can do anything. Skills also have long animations, so if you try to use a skill while an enemy is attacking, you'll be taking those hits head on. The combat animations and alternate attacks for each character make combat fun even without the RPG elements. Cloud can change between a heavy slow attack or staggering fast attacks. Tifa can make her combos faster the more pressure she applies, and then finish off with some special move based on how much you've been attacking. Even Barret can use different weapons for shooting bullets, missiles, or just melee attacks. FF7 Remake makes the combat feel strategic and make the skills feel huge and exciting. Rather than forcing combat into an RPG or RPG into combat, the game started from scratch to make combat and RPG elements complement each other. Even though fighting seems rushed and confusing, you have to keep focusing on so many different elements. Enemy weaknesses, where an attack is coming from, which character you should be using right now, You also have to decide between using an item, magic, or skill at any one time, since any one of these actions will use up the ATB bar that you just filled up, and now you have to charge it up again to make another action. It even has a huge roster of party members, which is only going to increase in the sequel. So fighting never really gets boring since you have so many unique characters to use and level up. Having the best gameplay used with our favorite cast can only end up in making another flawless game. And finally, we get to Final Fantasy 16 and where it stands as a Final Fantasy game. To be fair, I was confused why they didn't just continue with the same combat style as Final Fantasy VII Remake, since it could have become the new norm for Final Fantasy gameplay. Instead, we got something that seems more like an evolved version of Crisis Core gameplay. Now, given that Crisis Core also got a remake recently, it's strange that it hasn't been put through the same comparisons as Final Fantasy 16. Now, one of the first concerns is that Final Fantasy 16 is compared heavily to Devil May Cry. And that makes sense considering Platinum Games helped with the combat. As far as story, characters, and Final Fantasy lore is concerned, Final Fantasy 16 rivals many of the other games in the series. The only decisive factor is the lack of RPG elements. Now, it's not that there are no RPG elements, but simply that RPG elements aren't as pronounced as the other games. As we saw in previous games, combat and RPG are tough to combine, so you should either focus on one or try to keep a very careful balance between both and structure the game around that system. Since FF7 Remake series is already taking over in terms of RPG combat, there's no real point in making the same kind of game for Final Fantasy 16. At the same time, games like Crisis Core and Final Fantasy 15 can't reach their true potential until they specialize in either action or RPG focus. Final Fantasy 16 decided to create a game that stands out as a new-gen game with amazing visuals and an impactful story. The narrative in Final Fantasy 16, along with the large-scale fights, can benefit from action gameplay. And rather than making a mediocre game that forces RPG or making a sad clone of Final Fantasy VII's Remake, they created an original title that's still engaging and has a thoughtful yet fast-paced combat. Final Fantasy 16 doesn't really compare to the Final Fantasy formula for a number of reasons. Games like Nier Automata and God of War are also action-focused, but there's a lot of room to manage equipment, weapons, and upgrades. These kinds of upgrades and builds provide satisfaction in knowing that we used our brain to make sure we deal a lot of damage and use the game mechanics to our advantage. There's a lot of thought going on even though it's an action game. Changing our gear based on the situation makes us feel prepared for all kinds of situations. But Final Fantasy 16 focuses more on speed, aggression, and reflexes. It's not a skill test, but you still have more to gain by spamming attacks and skills and countering every attack rather than watching your enemy and thinking of a good way to hit their weaknesses. You don't need several weapons or specific elements. You have only one character, excluding Best Boy Torgal. You can only use a sword and you have several elemental attacks to switch between. Combined with a lack of an MP meter, this means you don't really need to think about wasting an action or not having enough MP. You just need to cycle attacks and skills to make consistent combos. It feels like every player can play the same way as long as they're skilled enough. Final Fantasy 16 has a complex and engaging combat system. It still uses staggering elements and cooldown management, but the self-customization doesn't feel unique and personal. This isn't my character, it's the game's character. The same way that I can use Dante to pull off some great moves, but my Cloud will have a specific sword with a specific material. Maybe I'll want to use Tifa more than I use Cloud. It's not about being a linear game, it's about having a linear character. It's not a bad thing, but there's a valid point in saying that Final Fantasy 16 doesn't do what every other Final Fantasy game has done. If it wasn't a mainline game, it might not have been a problem. But Final Fantasy 16 gives the feeling that Square Enix isn't afraid to abandon its past formula. Personally, I think the Final Fantasy Remake will be the new standard for Final Fantasy games in the future. But there's no denying that Final Fantasy is definitely turning into an action series as the title moves forward. At the end, Final Fantasy 16 is still hanging on to the Final Fantasy ideals. It just won't follow on the turn-based formula, and it's honestly a better decision than experimenting with more unconventional methods like in the older games. The same way every Final Fantasy game has unique mechanics and ideas, Final Fantasy 16 is continuing the trend with its different combat and its commitment to its story and cast. But that was my take on the Final Fantasy 16 discussion. Everyone has their own ideas on what makes the core of a series, but those opinions are what make games innovative and fun. A good game is a game that everyone can appreciate. If you want to give your thoughts on the video, please leave a comment. I'm always excited to see what you guys think. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like. And if you want to see more videos like this one, then subscribe for more gaming opinions. I hope to see you here again. See you.